Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. My name is Darius. I work as a psychological consultant for about 5 years now. I provide psychological consulting and emotional help. And today I would like to talk to you about a very common, although very interesting, at least to me, question about relationships. People, clients and acquaintances and other people that I know tell me, or I observe, stories where a person is treating their significant other, their romantic partners, or their close friends unjustly, unfairly, even abusively. People tell me that they had a fight, for example, and the other person was yelling at them or throwing things around, or the person who is telling the story or the person who I am observing is doing that thing to their partner, and they feel bad about it and they want to understand what is happening and why. And then I let them know, usually, that this is not quite healthy, this is not very efficient, not very effective way to resolve conflicts and handle relationships. And I also express empathy and say that it must be difficult to have this kind of relationship. I wonder if there are better ways how to handle it. And sometimes people say to me that, no, this person is not like this when we are around other people. They are only acting this way when I'm with them, when we are having a fight. And then I say, isn't this a little bit weird? Because this person presumably is the closest person that you have, if that's your romantic partner, for example, your life partner. You have chosen this partner, you have chosen each other to be together, to build a life together, and you are treating each other worse than you would treat somebody else that you don't know, like a service person or a stranger or somebody that you meet on a street or in a party. That's a little bit weird, isn't it? So today I would like to talk to you about the reasons why this is happening and why this is so prevalent. And I would like to mention a few factors in it. First, it is worth mentioning that people choose their partners, their important close relationships, based on their previous relationships with their primary caregivers. They unconsciously have been programmed to choose a partner that has certain characteristics. And even though you ask somebody, what kind of person would you like to have in your life? And most of them say something. Most of the people say something superficial, actually, like he has to be tall or she has to be pretty and things like that. But if you ask deeper questions, they might say that I want to have a kind person, an empathetic person, a person that would be interesting and would know how to handle relationships, who would be mature and things like that. But studies show and observations show that it's not working quite like that, because people choose relationships unconsciously. If they are unaware, if they don't have a lot of self-knowledge, if they didn't do a lot of self-work beforehand, their choices are unconscious, and the traits that they are using to determine their close relationships, their future partners, are mainly negative traits. So they try to find a person who has similar traits as their caregivers, but those traits are negative, not positive, because they want to replicate their primary relationships and deal with it in a different environment. They want to repeat the same pattern unconsciously that they were involved in as children, and I will talk about that a little bit later. There are many factors why this is happening. One of them is bias or projection. So, in other words, you don't see the other person, your significant other or your friend or somebody else that is close to you, that you are interacting with, accurately. You have a fantasy of them, you have a projection of them, you have some kind of fantasy of who they are, and then you project this fantasy onto them and you interact with the fantasy that you have instead of interacting with the actual person. Therefore, you might have a skewed perception of this other person. Therefore, your reaction might be inaccurate. Therefore, you might treat the other person unfairly. So, skewed perception, magical thinking, black and white thinking, idealization, devaluation, things like that. I will talk about this more in our upcoming podcast that will be published in a few weeks from now. But this is very common. This is very fundamental to a relationship to figure this out. If you have a realistic perception of the other person, or are you just projecting some kind of picture? Maybe you want for the other person to have certain qualities. Maybe you overreact because they remind you of somebody else in your life that you haven't dealt with, and therefore you don't actually react to your significant other or your friend, but you lash out on them. Meanwhile, unconsciously you have some other person in mind because that was your experience with interacting with people. Another factor is closeness. A lot of people feel triggered when they are in a close proximity, emotional proximity, psycho-emotional proximity with another person. So if you are close to somebody, you might feel uncomfortable or you might crave closeness. Here also a lot of unprocessed trauma and unprocessed relationships from the past play a huge role. So you might crave closeness and you might be codependent, or you might be very put off by closeness, you might be very afraid of closeness, which is counterdependency. Both of those things, codependency and counterdependency, are on the same token of dependency. So closeness might trigger some unpleasant emotion in you, and I will talk about that very soon. The next factor is feeling stuck in a relationship because the relationship reminds you of your primary relationship with your caregivers. So if in your primary relationship with your caregivers you felt unsafe, you were abused or neglected or abandoned, or any of your needs weren't met, which is child abuse, and it leads to traumatization if you experienced any of that, a close relationship might remind you of that, and you might feel a similar way that you felt when you were a child, and closeness might be associated, as I've talked before, with danger. Therefore, you might feel not only triggered by closeness and feel like you are in danger, therefore you might overreact to the situation or project onto the situation, transfer onto the situation your primary relationship. But also you might feel stuck because as a child you didn't have a chance to escape because you were dependent on your caregivers, so you needed them, and their approval and lack of conflict was vital to you. So if you feel stuck, if this reminds you of your primary relationship where you couldn't escape, and now something happens in your relationship and you feel the same way, that maybe you are stuck and you can't escape. Intellectually you might know that, okay, I'm an adult and both of us are here mutually and nobody's forcing anybody to be here, but psycho-emotionally you still might feel like a child sometimes when you are triggered, and therefore you might overreact, and therefore your partner might overreact too, because if they are unresolved too, they might experience a similar thing. And people try to deal with that with their unprocessed emotions in this repetition compulsive way. They find a relationship where they could feel the same way as they felt when they were children, and then they try to master the situation, try to resolve conflicts or get into conflicts or resolve their emotions by being in an adult relationship without dealing with their actual primary relationship. So they either treat others how they were treated, or they find a relationship where they could be treated the way that they were treated as children. They can try to master it and relive it, and all of this is called repetition compulsion, and you don't want to do that, ideally. The last factor that I want to talk about is lack of communication skills, lack of conflict resolution skills. So, a person might not know how to deal with a conflict, how to deal with their overwhelming emotions, how to regulate their emotions, how to resolve a difficult situation. And if they, as children, didn't have healthy boundaries with their primary caregivers, they might not have healthy boundaries in their adult relationships. So one person might be submissive, another person might be domineering, and therefore those two personalities work together well in an unhealthy way, because one wants to be submissive and another one wants to be domineering and power seeking, so they work together well, but this is unhealthy. These are unhealthy boundaries, which leads to a lot of conflict, either inner conflict or interpersonal conflict.